Welcome to today's WRR lecture with the theme Open Society, its old enemies and its new friends. I think it's time to invite our keynote speaker, our lecturer, to come to the floor. Professor Ignatieff, may I ask you to come to the stage?
If you think about what the ideal of an open society is, you kind of come with four ideas, it seems to me. The first claim is an epistemological one. Closed societies define the truth of their people. Open societies leave the determination of truth to a free process of scientific falsification. The distinctive feature of Popper's version of liberal democracy is that it put its emphasis on the epistemological basis of what we do. I think the second aspect of open society is a political claim, which is that closed societies favor mass coercion, single-party domination. Open societies privilege a politics that Popper called piecemeal social engineering. And the miracle that is Western liberal prosperity since 1945 is the result of piecemeal social engineering, by which I mean learning from your mistakes. God knows we've made mistakes getting to the Netherlands of 2017, but we got there with piecemeal social engineering, massive public debate, resistance argument, and incrementally we produce this enormous edifice of wealth. The third claim I think about open society is a moral claim, which is liberal societies are societies that care about individuals' retail. Individuals matter. We talk a lot about diversity and difference, but the difference that we care about morally is the difference between each of you in the room. The final claim is a historical claim. One of the things that open societies and liberal democracy have said for themselves with particular confidence in the 70s and 80s was that in the long run, open societies would prevail over closed ones. That is, there was a tacit historical narrative in the post-45 world that open societies would eventually win out. And if I think there's one thing that's got us troubled in 2017, it's suddenly a doubt, particularly posed by China and other closed societies, as to whether that historical narrative remains true. Another thing we need, I think, to say, which is open society itself has changed enormously since 1945. The open society that Karl Popper took for granted in 1945 when he was writing is unimaginable or unrecognizable to us now. It was a society of rationing, exchange controls, nationalized industries, confiscatory rates of taxation, mobilization for reconstruction, strongly national cultures, strongly mono-ethnic societies, and held together by, on the one hand, the memory of fascism and the totalitarian threat in the future. And that's a very different situation for open societies. Now we look at a very different open society with free movement of capital, hyper-migration, hyper-connectivity, hyper-diversity, a state that is in some sense, thanks to the neoliberal revolution, less strong and interventionist than it was in 1945. Much higher levels of inequality in 2017 than the wartime mobilizations in the 1940s. Much more oligopoly. Open societies trying to find their bearings and their cultural space in a globalized culture. And this convulsion of change, I think, has produced within open society a deep nostalgia for the open society of the past, which was in fact a much more closed society. It's also the case that closed societies have changed enormously. If you think of the closed society of 1945, it was autarky, socialism in one country, sealed frontiers, no exit, no voice, and loyalty based on coercion, to use Albert Hirschman's exit, voice, and loyalty distinctions. If you flash forward to 2017, our closed societies are unrecognizably different. They've been inserted into the global capitalist economy. They function on what could be called rule by law as opposed to rule of law. Crucially, they allow exit but no voice. And one of the elements that I think is most difficult in thinking about the future of open society is the collusive relationship between open societies in 27 and closed societies, to a degree that we need to that pose the biggest questions in international relations and international security is whether open societies are essentially maintaining closed societies. Think about it for a minute. Chinese capitalism allows anybody who's unhappy with the internal party regime to offshore their resources in Vancouver or Amsterdam or London. Anybody who is unhappy with Hungary can exit through Schengen. This kind of regime, precisely because it has insertion into the capitalist world, may be much more stable. It may have a much longer future in the 21st century than the closed societies that we thought we'd beaten after 1989. The same dilemma is posed by the illiberal democracies in Eastern Europe, Hungary and Poland. These societies are parasitic on the openness of Western Europe. But Western Europe faces a dilemma. If they enforce a community of values, if they say Europe has to stand for something, there's a risk that these two societies and many other societies in Eastern Europe will simply back out of the club. So these issues of collusion between open and closed societies are not usually posed, but they seem to me to be critical to the future of the international relations of liberal democracies as a whole. Another way to think about the relationship between open and closed societies is the other side of the coin, which is the ways in which closed societies are now directly intervening in our own democracies. Nobody can look at the cyber interference in the election processes in Western Europe and in the United States without having deep alarm at the ways in which closed societies are now intervening and manipulating and trying to shape public opinion in open ones. And this raises questions about how we manage cyberspace and the internet, and whether we can do so consistent with our own valued freedoms. How do we safeguard, literally, the integrity of our democracies through the 21st century? Seems to me a question we're now fumbling to find answers for. The challenge to open societies don't stop there. Need to say, I hardly need to mention the fact that the vision of an open society is challenged by the border question. Almost everybody, if asked, in our democratic publics, when asked, do you like the idea of an open society, they say, sure, we like an open society, but we'd like closed borders. And so we're living in that contradiction. Openness and human rights, a similar conflict. The majoritarian populism we're seeing sweeping through the world is increasingly resistant to international human rights invigilation from the outside. One of the other challenges about an open society goes back to the first point I made, which is that these societies have an epistemological basis. We believe in a marketplace of ideas. We believe that facts are stubborn things. Facts are objective. Facts can be found. Why does WRR exist? It exists because it believes there is such a thing as a fact. They do believe that Mr. Rutte, your prime minister, would decide a little better if he decided on the basis of facts. So the rationale of the whole outfit is based on a certain epistemology. And yet, there's no question that the authority of the scientific people in this room is challenged as never before. We all know the Brexit, Mr. Gov's infamous remark about the people being tired of experts. But this is a challenge to professional authority and professional expertise that challenges the legitimacy of everybody in this room, including me. And it results in a strong kind of anti-empirical majoritarianism in which the test of truth is what a majority believe to be true. And there's another challenge as well, which relates to what I said earlier about the ways in which closed societies are manipulating our democracy, there's some challenges inside to democracy that we need to think about. You could almost ask whether open society is destroying democracy. That's a provocative question. It can't be true, but there's some element of it that is disturbingly true at the moment. If you look at what the digital revolution has done to democracy, the digital revolution is premised on openness, on frontierless digital communications. But it's having a couple of effects that we're all struggling to think about. One of them is what I would call virtual disinhibition. Let me tell you a story from my political life. As you know, I was fantastically successful in politics, so I got an opportunity to lecture you about politics at length. But one of the things I noticed in politics is that I shook many thousands of hands in the 5 years that I had my triumphant political career. And precisely because it was so triumphant, one of the things I learned is that I never had a disagreeable word with any fellow citizen when I was face to face. Astoundingly, the rules of decorum prevailed in democracy. The internet was something else. The other component of that, or related phenomenon, I would call algorithmic segregation. You may know it by the term filter bubbles. We're all increasingly prisoners, and we are as much prisoners as anybody else, of the bubbles of information within which we work. We've unleashed a monster in our politics, which is anonymous comment on the internet. The disinhibiting effect of anonymous comment is producing a kind of rage and hatred and contempt in politics, which used to be disciplined by the face-to-face interactions of the democratic agora. You may know it by the term filter bubbles. We're all increasingly prisoners, and we are as much prisoners as anybody else, of the bubbles of information within which we work. And the public space in which we make common decisions and share common factual bases for argument and policy determination is fragmenting. And one of the ways that I think, one of the things we need as policy professionals to avoid is the thought that we are not in a filter bubble, it's those poor other people who are. Folks, let's wake up. We're all in a filter bubble, and this is reducing our capacity for the rough shared experience, the rough sense of common fate on which a democratic politics depends. One of the unstated premises of democracy is someone who loses an election today could win it the day after tomorrow. And one of the geniuses of democracy is that it finds a way to handle loss. The confiscation of virtue refers to something I think we've all seen from 2015 to 2017 in Europe. Spontaneous demonstrations of compassion, mercy, solidarity, and friendship in September 2015 by populations who, for example, flooded to railway stations to aid and assist refugees, has been replaced by a language of border closing and shutting off the frontier and shutting out strangers. This is what I mean by the confiscation of virtue, and it is fatal to a country. It is fatal to a country because it's ultimately corrosive of the generosity, compassion, and mercy necessary to the internal cohesion of a society. So all of this, virtual disinhibition, algorithmic segregation, the attack on expertise, the weakening support for open markets, the empowerment of a politics of enemies versus a politics of adversaries, culminating in the confiscation of the virtues. We're in a tough time, folks. I sometimes think I've given you a kind of cold shower down your neck. It's not, I'm actually fiercely optimistic about the future of liberal democracy. You wouldn't know it from what I've said. But I actually think the only way to get to optimism is to look it squarely in the face and some of the problems. What do I conclude? And I really will conclude quickly. if you go back to the open society of 1945, one of the things you realize is how much Popper's vision of an open society depended on a strong sovereign state. Sovereignty requires strong states, capable states, states with tax capacity, states with the capacity to coerce, states with the capacity to collaborate with others. This is not a paean to Brexit, let me tell you. You can't be a strong state in the modern world unless you collaborate with others. I think the Netherlands has understood how their own sovereignty is integrally dependent on European integration. But a strong state is only a strong state to the degree that it creates equal starting conditions for all citizens, for the sake of inclusion, for the sake of cohesion. But also strong states are states that control their borders. Again, a message from the perfect country, Canada. Our famous generosity and welcome for refugees and migrants is premised on border control. Strong states need strong citizens. People like you, participatory, demanding, informed, difficult. They show up at meetings on rainy Thursday nights. They demand accountability. They push states to perform. They don't sit out elections. They come and vote. The culture of civic engagement and participation is crucial to a strong state. And finally, almost my last word, strong states need strong institutions. Free media, free courts, free professions, free universities. This is, it seems to me, points us in the direction of a very different vision of open society, in which open society is conditional on sovereignty, conditional on states with the capacity to enforce and defend the conditions of life for their citizens. Thank you so much for your attention.